Dale Russakoff is a veteran journalist. I hesitate to say that because that, you know, people my age at least, that makes it, that's sort of like saying it's an old person, but as a veteran journalist, having spent almost 3 decades at the Washington Post, including a pretty long stretch in the New York bureau covering issues in the New York metropolitan area, and I guess Newark as well. I just want to, you know, her book has really stirred tremendous interest, maybe accounting in part for the nice turnout here tonight, but and many people have had nice things to say about it, including people who weren't necessarily favorably portrayed in the book, which I think is pretty impressive. I just want to quote from Publishers Weekly in a starred review, just to give you a sense of the critical acclaim. Russakoff's eagle-eyed view of the current state of the public education system in Newark and the United States is one of the finest education surveys in recent memory. It's a wonderful example of serious long-form journalism that incorporates a lot of the ideas out there percolating in the academic community, but does it in a way that feels like a story, feels like fun, feels like you're watching TV, and I'll let Dale tell the story now.
Thank you so much, Jeff, and thanks for everyone, to everyone for coming and for having me here tonight. I imagine that a lot of you remember 5 years ago the media swirl when Mark Zuckerberg announced on the Oprah show that he was giving $100 million to the Newark schools. It was a pretty sensational event. There was the fact that it happened on the Oprah show, there was the 26-year-old billionaire, there was the star quality mayor of Newark, Cory Booker, and then there was the rising star, Chris Christie, who was in his own Republican Party. And there were their incredible promises that they made. They said they were going to do what no one had done before. They were going to take an impoverished school district where failure was very widespread and completely turn it around into one of universal high-performing schools. And they weren't going to stop there. They were going to create a model in Newark for how to turn around any urban school district and take it from one city to the next. Zuckerberg was going to use his philanthropy to take it across the country and to solve the crisis of opportunity for poor children all across America. As you may have heard, it didn't really come out that way. Zuckerberg didn't emerge from Newark with a model for even turning around Newark, much less the rest of the country. There are actually a number of good things that did come of this, and I would like to talk about them. But the hoped-for model for how to transform struggling schools in the poorest communities did not come about. And nor was it at all realistic to expect that it would. They were going to do this in 5 years, they said. And how could you take a school district that had been in decline for decades, where the poverty rate of children is twice the national average, and expect to create what Cory Booker was calling a hemisphere of hope in 5 years. Changing an education system in a major city takes decades, not 5 years or not years. And it takes reckoning with the extensive impact of poverty on children's ability to learn, on their minds and on their lives. And it takes leaders who'll stay with the work for a generation. And none of those things were present in Newark. In fact, the Booker and Christie were really thinking on a politician's timeline, 5 years. And in less than 5 years, they had both moved on, Cory Booker to the Senate and Christie, as we know, to the campaign trail. But I think there's a lot to learn from what happened in Newark, and particularly about the complex and essential work of equipping urban schools to meet the challenges of the kids who come to them. I wanted to, in that light, try to reflect on what Newark tells us about the education reform movement, what it does and doesn't offer children in the poorest cities, how difficult it is to change a district given all the entrenched interests inside it, and a lesson Mark Zuckerberg learned the hard way, how important it is for philanthropists to really know the communities that they hope to change. Actually, Mark Zuckerberg was not the mastermind in any way of this effort. He had met Cory Booker 2 months before the announcement on Oprah, and to put it in the starkest terms, he was just swept off his feet by him, and he thought that he had Superman on his team, and that he actually thought he was going to learn from Cory Booker how to use philanthropy to make major changes in what appeared to be intractable problems. The New York schools had been under the control of the state for 15 years at the time of the announcement, and that was a result of an investigation that had been done starting in the 1980s into the 90s that found absolutely rampant corruption at the top and appalling neglect of children throughout the system. And when Booker told Zuckerberg that they would use the governor's absolute power over the schools because of the state control and Booker's bully pulpit, he signed on. And he said on Oprah that he was doing what he would do in private business. He was finding great leaders and he was investing in them and getting out of the way. He told me later that he thought he was supporting what the majority of people on the ground in Newark wanted for themselves. And he said to me, I thought that the governor and the mayor would engage the community. They're politicians, isn't that what they do? So he didn't answer the question. But interestingly, no one consulted the people on the ground in Newark in planning a complete upheaval and transformation of their children's schools. Newark parents and teachers learned of the $100 million gift at the same moment as Oprah's national television audience. The initial agenda was drawn up by the McKinsey consulting firm at the request of Mayor Booker, and it mirrored the agenda of the education reform movement, that potent combination of billionaire philanthropists, charter school leaders, social entrepreneurs, and politicians in both parties who want to upend the status quo of public schools and the unionized bureaucracies that tend to run them. The goals were to rapidly expand the charter schools in Newark, to close failing schools, to build a state-of-the-art data system that could hold everyone accountable, to relax tenure and seniority protections so as to eliminate the weakest teachers, and to replace them with teachers recruited from throughout the country through alternative training programs like Teach for America. Zuckerberg's personal priority, the main goal he had, was to change the teacher's contract and have one that would no longer reward teachers for seniority, but rather would base all raises on teacher performance, which he defined as teachers raising their students' test scores. He said that at Facebook, this is the way people are rewarded for performance, and they get major bonuses for it, and if he didn't have that system at Facebook, if he was rewarding everyone for seniority, he wouldn't have the greatest workers and talent, the best talent in the world, competing to come to Facebook. He said he couldn't succeed without that kind of talent, so how could the public schools in the poorest cities, where there couldn't be a greater challenge than that, how could they succeed without having these most talented college graduates beating down their doors? So as I said, a number of good things came of the effort. New principals were installed in a number of schools, and some of them really did bring vision, energy, and really good instructional leadership to their schools. There was a new teacher evaluation system that was created, and principals felt that it really did define much more clearly what good teaching was and help them figure out how to coach teachers to higher levels of effectiveness. And then there was a teacher's contract that was negotiated at great expense, took over $50 million in philanthropy to subsidize it. And for the first time, it conditioned raises in the city of Newark, in the school district, on teachers being rated effective or highly effective. So if you were rated ineffective for the first time, you would not get a raise. Let's see. Oh, and I guess another very major effect was that the reform, the philanthropy subsidized a major expansion of charter schools in Newark. When the project started, fewer than 20% of children were in charter schools, and they're now on a path in the next year or two to reach 40% of kids in charter schools. While charter schools nationally do not outperform district schools, in Newark, the charter schools do outperform the district schools, some of them extremely significantly. And so, according to the Center for, the Center for Reinvention of Public Education in Seattle, Newark now has one of the highest rates of children in schools that are beating the state average, and that's almost exclusively because of the charter schools in Newark. With all of this, that was, part of the architecture of the plan, there was something that wasn't there. And there was no plan to address the issues that children living in poverty bring into the classroom. 45% of Newark children live below the poverty line. And as I said, that's twice the national average. And the consequences begin unbelievably early. One of the statistics that I came across in doing this reporting that literally, just if a number can make you cry, 40% of babies born in Newark have had no prenatal care or inadequate prenatal care. So they're disadvantaged before they even draw their first breath. As part of the community engagement that was organized for this gift, there were 10 community forums, and I went to all of them, and overwhelmingly, the thing that parents and teachers and community leaders said was necessary, they were asked, what do you think we need to do with this money? They said we need more support for kids at the classroom level who come to school traumatized by the instability of poverty, witnessing violence, living in incredibly challenging communities. We need more teachers, more social workers, more counselors, more tutors. And that was just like every forum, that was what parents and teachers were saying. Sort of in line with the lack of attention to local community concerns, none of those things found their way into the reform plan. In fact, the whole reform effort was managed by a political consultant from New York City who didn't know his way around Newark, didn't even know how to get around the city. And he was a consultant to the charter movement in Newark and was well known to Cory Booker as a result of that. So Booker brought him in. He ultimately was paid over $2 million for his work. And one of the board members of the foundation that paid his bill said that what he did was basically PR, not community engagement. And Cory Booker's chief of staff himself told me he considered that money a boondoggle. To be clear, the Newark schools were in serious need of reform at the time of this gift. In fact, there was a wide consensus in the community that the status quo was unacceptable. Only 40% of children were passing the school standardized tests. Only 54% of high school students were graduating, and 90% of the students who graduated from the Newark Public Schools and went to the local community college needed to take remedial classes just to be qualified for college-level work. So the reform movement has a mantra. It says that poverty is an excuse for failure in cities like Newark and across the country. And that is unquestionably true in Newark for some people in some schools. But as I witnessed continually for 4.5 years, poverty is also a root cause of failure for children who literally are traumatized from growing up amid violence, family strife, and constant instability. Here's an example from my reporting. Avon Avenue School is located in one of the poorest catchment areas in Newark. I regularly attended a kindergarten class there of 26 children, of whom 15 had child welfare cases. These are children who were victims of neglect. They've been exposed to violence, exposed to drugs. And some of those children at age 5 were already so emotionally damaged and so angry that they were hitting other children and throwing chairs across the classroom. And this was a routine event. Now, not only were these children unable to learn, the children in the rest of the class were so frightened that many of them were unable to learn also. That class had one of the best teachers in any Newark district or charter school, and I'm actually honored to say she's here tonight. Her name is Princess Visami. She's a graduate of Columbia Teachers College. But in spite of her incredible skill, on many days, those skills were not enough to overcome these challenges. She did not need excuses. She needed help. I also spent time at Spark Academy, which is a KIPP elementary school in Newark. Spark had some children, although not as many, who were equally troubled. They also had way more resources to support them and their teachers. They had 2 teachers in every classroom in grades kindergarten through 3. They had a tutor for every grade to support the children who couldn't keep up, even with 2 teachers in the classroom. They had 3 social workers in a school of 520 children who did therapy with 70 children a week. Those are children who needed the therapy just to be able to go into the class and learn. And they also had a dean of student and family engagement, whose job it was to find supports outside the school for children whose learning issues came from outside the classroom, not in it. The principal of Spark, of this charter school, told me that there was no way that her school would have been a high-performing charter school, which it was, if she had not had those extra resources. In other words, a high-performing charter school would not have been high-performing if it had the budget of the district school to work with. The Newark district spends $18,000 to $20,000 per student on average, but only $8,000 per student reaches Avon Avenue School. By contrast, and that money, that $8,000, has to pay the teachers, the social workers, the tutors, the counselors, the security guards, the principal, the vice principal, the people who deliver education to the kids, $8,000. Spark Academy, as a kids school, starts out with a little bit less per student, and what gets to the school is $12,000. So that's 50% more. Now, the Newark schools have tremendous expenses that the charters don't have. They have unbelievably aging facilities. The average school building is 80 years old. And there are there's scaffolding around so many of the schools in Newark because bricks have fallen off, and even a lintel fell off of a school the night before Michelle Obama visited it, which was very scary. So they have expenses for the facilities. They have huge expenses for special education. But they also have a lot of legacy costs from being an employer of last resort in a city that's shot through with poverty and politics. There are political bosses who have gotten a lot of people jobs in Newark that at this point the jobs are still there and protected by union contracts and not really, if you're talking about efficiency, it's not there. I actually called my book The Prize because the Newark School District has been a prize for generations for the political bosses who were very intent on using the jobs of the district to reward their friends and allies. It's the number one public employer in Newark, and number 2, it has the second largest payroll in the city, second only to United Airlines, which is headquartered at Newark Airport. The other problem, though, is that laying off school district employees means eliminating jobs with good salaries and good benefits for working class people in a city that has very few jobs of that kind. And you could also end up destabilizing the lives of children in the public schools. So it's not a simple process of trying to get that money to the classroom where it could do the most help, where it could help the most. At the moment, the district schools are in another kind of crisis. They're in a really severe financial crisis because of the exodus of kids, so many kids, to the charter schools. Because the city is not really growing, as kids leave for charters, the money follows them and no extra money comes in. So the new superintendent who came into Newark announced that there was a $60 million budget hole, that the only way to close it was to start cutting. And so the kinds of services that I was telling you about that are so desperately needed for the children in the district schools have also been cut in that process. Now, the reform leaders, Booker, Christie, and the others, did not plan for this eventuality. When they set out to dramatically increase the charter schools, even though Tammy Anderson, who was the superintendent until last June, warned them about this exact outcome early and often. When I asked Cory Booker how failing schools would turn into high-performing schools, he said, and I quote, "They will melt into many different school models. They're going to flower, just like the cherry blossoms in Branch Brook Park." Clearly, he and no one else had a roadmap for he didn't have a roadmap, and neither did anyone else, for the treacherous path from failure to utopia. In the district schools, which still enroll 60% of the children in Newark, student performance has gone down, not up, on the standardized test in the last 5 years since this gift was given. So there's a very stark contrast. Charter schools with 40% of Newark children are beating the odds, while district schools with 60% are doing worse, in spite of some of the positive systems changes that I mentioned that were made with the Zuckerberg money. Another issue in Newark was that this effort was imposed, the reforms were imposed from the top down on a city with deep and very justified suspicions of wealthy outsiders. Going back to the days of urban renewal and white flight, Newark residents have developed what one city councilman called extreme xenophobia, fearing that white people, having fled Newark in the 1960s, are going to come back and take away what little remains for them. The reform effort played directly into this narrative. Other than Booker, the architects were all white and from outside the city. Booker and the other leaders hired consultants to design the reforms of the district, almost all of them white, none of them from Newark, and most of them paid $1,000 a day. $20 million of the $200 million in philanthropy ended up going to pay consultants. The existence of these consulting contracts made big news when the Star-Ledger, the local newspaper, was leaked a document drawn up by one of the consulting firms very, very early on in the process that said that showed that a number of Newark district schools were going to be closed and turned over to charter schools. Now, nothing about district school closings or charter school expansion was mentioned in these 10 community forums that cost $2 million for community engagement. So this was just, an extremely alarming result, and it played directly into the worst fears of Newark residents. There were 600 people that came to the next school board meeting, and I should tell you, before that, I went to school board meetings and there were like maybe a dozen people there, but 600 people came. They filled the room, they were pounding on the doors when the fire code limit was reached, and they were demanding answers. There was a leading citizen of Newark who grew up in the city who said, "This is the Newark nightmare. We drank this with our mother's milk." More than a third of schools were eventually closed, restructured, relocated, repurposed, or turned over to charter schools, with parents having no opportunity to weigh in on how these changes would affect their children. I wondered at times whether the leaders of the reform effort, how they would have reacted if these kinds of disruptive and sweeping changes had come to their school district and affected their kids. I think that they felt that they were doing this with the best of intentions. They felt that by making this a democratic process, it would have been taken captive by unions and political bosses who wanted to protect the status quo. So they felt the best thing to do for children was to just move full steam ahead and try to literally bypass the community. At one point, though, a leading pastor warned Governor Christie that he really felt there could be another Newark riot comparable to the '67 riot because anger was so great. And the anger poured directly into the mayor's race since Cory Booker, his term was up, and he had gone to the Senate, and the anger ended up fueling the election of Raz Baraka, who was a city councilman and also a school principal and the leading opponent of all of the reforms. He ran on a platform in promising to stop all the reforms in their tracks, and he won decisively. In spite of the fact that the reform movement raised $5 million for his opponent to try to stop him. I've been criticized for not emphasizing how strong the unions were and what a role they played in trying to stop the reforms. But I don't think that he could have won that decisively with almost a $5 million deficit in fundraising if this had just been a union opposition. What the reformers didn't realize is that they really did trigger something so deep and resonant in Newark. And there was, I think the word I heard the most in Newark as I was covering this over the 4.5 years was disrespect. People felt disrespected, and that was so powerful and so offensive that some of the ideas of the reformers that I think might have been quite acceptable became anathema, and they just wanted them out. They wanted them to go away. Now, I think everybody knows the battle in Newark is in many ways a microcosm of a larger national battle over the future shape of education. When I began reporting, the movie Waiting for Superman had just come out. And right after that, 2 websites went online within days of each other. One was called waitingforsuperman.org. The other was called notwaitingforsuperman.org. I really was amazed by the polarization that this debate has caused. And I thought that it was really, that both sides were missing so much about what children really need in a city like Newark or most of the really struggling inner cities. And I thought they were just leaving a lot out, that there was this debate with a hole in the middle of it, and that the children of Newark and of all of the really struggling cities were caught in that hole. And I actually think this was the main reason I wanted to write this book, because it seemed to me like this was an opportunity for journalism. That if you could write the story of what the status quo and the reforms were doing for children in Newark, children in charter schools and in district schools, and create a story that was indisputably complete and true, that maybe there could be a different kind of conversation about what children need in order to succeed. And within the polarized conversation, perhaps the biggest debate is whether you have to solve poverty in order to improve education. I really felt from my reporting that you don't have to solve poverty to improve education, but you have to address the consequences of poverty. And I would like to just leave you with a story that kind of illustrated this to me. As I want to come back to this charter school, Spark Academy. And there was one day that a mother who had 3 children at that school and an infant at home arrived at the school. She had been beaten to a pulp by her boyfriend. She was holding her baby. She was bleeding and swollen, and the baby had a fractured skull. And she had come to the school for help. The principal of the school immediately just took her in hand, took pictures of her, called the police, showed the pictures, took her to the hospital, took her to the courthouse and waited with her for a lawyer to be assigned. And I interviewed the lawyer, and she said, I had never seen that in all my career, a principal coming to court with a victim. But what was even more unusual was what happened back at the school because of the resources that they had at that school. The dean of student and family engagement that I told you about, who works with problems that come from outside the school, she arranged a carpooling network of 7 different teachers who would pick these. The family had been located in a shelter that had a secret location but for their own safety. So they found a neutral spot, and there were 7 teachers who alternated picking up these kids every morning, bringing them to school, taking them home every day after school. Remember the 3 social workers? Well, the lead social worker worked with the kids. She counseled them to try to help them process what had happened so that they could feel safe and able to learn. She also worked with the teachers to help them figure out how to talk to the kids when they got afraid in class. And then as a result of all of these things, not one of those children missed a day of school, and all 3 of them ended the school year above grade level. So it was just really striking to see what a well-run school with resources could do in the face of true poverty and the dysfunctions that come with it. Also, I talked about this with Princess Sami, who was the teacher in the classroom at the time that had 26 children, 15 child welfare cases, and very little help. And I just asked her, what did she think of this? And I'd just like for, the last word to read you what she said. She said, we have to ask of every school, what does this particular school need in order to meet the challenges of the neighborhood it's situated in? And then we simply have to find the courage and the money to provide it. We have to be able to show children, why is this education meaningful? And how can you possibly do that if so many other things are not working? And I think that says it all. Thank you.
It's not just a book about school reform, it's a book about urban politics, about the relation of urban politics to state and national politics, about social inequality, about the role of philanthropy in American education and social policy, a whole range of issues. And in thinking about how to assemble a panel to talk about it, I thought, well, I could find someone who knows about each of those things, and we would have had a panel of about 8 or 9 people. So instead, I asked a couple of people who wear many hats and have lots of ideas about different things. So let me briefly introduce, next to Dale is Nicholas Lemon, who's a journalist himself, author of 5 books on a wide range of topics, including those relating to kind of early formation of big cities and within education to high stakes testing. He's the former dean at the Columbia Journalism School, was dean there for 10 years, and is continuing, at the journalism school and writing about a range of interesting issues, including as a staff writer for the New Yorker. Immediately to my left is Basil Smikle Jr. Basil's thought and written about and been a part of the politics of school reform as a candidate for the state legislature back in 2010, as a political consultant, as a frequent commentator. For a while, every time I turned on Channel 1, I'd see him on state and local state and national politics. He's currently the executive director of the New York State Democratic Party. And he's dealt with these things also as a student and a scholar here at TC. Basil's finishing up soon his dissertation in politics and education, which deals with issues around race, politics, and charter schools in New York. So I'm going to open this with a question to Dale, and I've got some specific questions for Nick and Basil, but we'll also exchange ideas a little bit, and I promise I'll leave some time for questions from the audience, because I know there's a lot of you out there with ideas and knowledge about these things as well. So Dale, I just wonder, as I said in introducing you, your books sparked an unusual amount of controversy and commentary, and you've been around and giving talks to various audiences. And I wonder what your sense is as to, on the one hand, whether some of the lessons of the book are being taken seriously by the people who it would make a difference if they did so, but also whether you have any skepticism that those lessons will be learned, or that the right lessons will be learned.
Well, I think one of the biggest lessons that was learned by Mark Zuckerberg. He and his wife recently announced the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, in which they're going to give away and invest 99% of their Facebook stock to try to make the world a better place for their daughter's generation. And they outlined 6 principles that are going to guide their giving and investing. And the first 2 were drawn directly from lessons they learned the hard way in Newark. The first one was that they will invest only for the long term, or support efforts that are only long-term efforts, because they felt that short-term thinking would not solve the great problems of their daughter's time. And then the second thing they said was that they would be sure to engage the people that they hope to help. And I just thought that was very striking. I think that there's evidence that they are very serious. They said at the outset, the first time I interviewed them, that they really knew nothing about philanthropy, that their goal was to learn and become better philanthropists. And I think that they really want to. I think they want to be different from the groupthink that has developed in a lot of big philanthropies. So I think that's good. And I've been invited to talk to a lot of city philanthropy coalitions, and people seem like philanthropists in general want to talk about this issue of how do we engage the community and how without sort of waiting forever for a community consensus to develop. It's a tension, but it seems like it's a live question in philanthropy, and I think that's a good thing. I also think that this same polarization has developed, around reactions to the book. I mean, there are some people in the reform movement. There was a review in the 74, which is an education reform website, that was very much sort of living in the gray areas that I think, I was trying to point out. And it said, if you read this book and think it confirms your biases, you're not trying hard enough. And that was like what I hoped the reaction would be. But then there's been a real effort to say that, that she, didn't see how transformational all of this was. And that I've also seen that the union in Newark, the local union, has become just extremely hardened in opposing everything that's related to the reform effort once again. So I don't think that there's a dramatic change, but I think there may be some people in some places who are thinking differently.
I want to just follow up on that for 1 second. So I also saw recently an article that argued that the problem, if there was a problem in Newark, is that it didn't go far enough in terms of charter schools, that too much of the money went to sort of sustaining the local institutions and kind of more aggressive pursuit of charterization on the New Orleans model would have been more sensible. Is that something you've encountered also, and how would that fly, at least in the Newark community?
Well, I think that I actually talked to the person who wrote that article, and I told him that the Newark charters felt they expanded as fast and as much as they could. I mean, Cami Anderson tried to get them to take over two each, both the KIPP schools and the Uncommon schools, to each take over 2 kindergarten through 8 schools. And both of them said they could only manage 1 school and only kindergarten through grade 4. So I think that, there is a capacity limit on how much these charter schools can expand. And there's still a lot of uncertainty about whether, I think that there's been a tremendous effort by the charter schools to do away with policies that lead to creaming. That used to be much more common. And again, Cami Anderson really pushed hard for this, and they agreed to everything she wanted. And I think the charter schools are now enrolling a more diverse group of kids than they ever have, but that's just starting. And I don't know that they, at this point, have the same mix of kids. One of the best charter schools in the city has a high school that's over 70% female. So that's not, that's not typical of Newark. And I think that they still have a ways to go to enroll a group of kids that has the same needs that the district schools do.
Basil, so I'll let you wear whichever hat you want to wear in answering this question, but you've dealt with and researched the reform movement and the charter movement, especially in the context of New York. And I wonder, what are your thoughts about, what's behind the failure of the reform community so often to anticipate some of these kinds of of reactions and accurately gauge what the community will rally behind and what it'll rally against.
Right. Thank you. So for full disclosure, yes, in my many political hats over the years, I've worked with a lot of people in the book. I was not a consultant, though. I did 21 minutes, a tremendous amount of money, but I was not a consultant, so I'll just put that out there. And a lot of my feelings about the tension between what's happening in the reform movement is in part because of my work in it, but it's also tempered by my mother, who was a 30-year special ed public school teacher here in New York City. So we talk about this every night. But one thing that what I wanted to start with to address your question more directly is remembering the Booker race and going back to an article you wrote, actually, in the Washington Post about the race in 2002. It's a great article because it really does talk about these racial cleavages. I'll take a step back. These political battles in Newark, and I'll talk about the cleavages in a second. But there's a quote that always stood out to me, where you have this reform-minded, and I don't mean in the sense of education, but this political reform-minded Cory Booker, what he called himself, I think he called himself a pragmatic Democrat. And I remember, so I went and looked for the quote. It's Sharp James speaking at a rally, and speaking as though he's talking to Cory Booker, and he says, "You have to learn to be an African American. We don't have time to train you." That is harsh. So it really did inform, I think, a lot of my response both to the book, but broadly to what happens on the ground with this movement and what's happening among the sort of reform-minded philanthropists and others. If you look at Cory, and he's sort of this post-racial, young, post-civil rights movement leader, he was talking about a lot of, he was this post-civil rights, post-racial candidate 2 years before Barack Obama gave his DNC keynote speech when he was still a state senator. You had Sharp James, who's this mayor born of the civil rights movement of a big city. I wouldn't say necessarily he's a civil rights mayor. I think you referred to him as that. I'd say he's sort of he's really a product, if you will, of the Black Power movement, where you had this, a few decades of leaders saying that we want to be able to teach our kids our way, this sort of self-determinist approach to education and creating all these alternative schools and independent schools, which were in Newark, here in New York as well. And then you have Governor Christie, who, if you haven't seen Governor Christie on television, and you haven't heard enough about him, he's often referred to as a bully. We can talk about whether or not that's true another time. But, he has this very, very strong he's a very strong political force. So you have these racial cleavages between these African-American residents who are not in control of their own school system, as Governor Christie is, who then brings in Cammie Alexander. But you also, this is down the road, but you're also starting from a place where you have this incredible conversation about blackness in the city of Newark. Andrea Gillespie, who's Black Politics, talks about this a lot in her book, these sort of different categories, if you will, of African-American leader. And there's this tension that's happening on the ground, and it's happening not just in Newark, but all over the place. So the lessons that I would take away from a lot of these tensions with all of these different players over the course of 10, 15 years is that there was a lot that was intended to be done well. I think there were a lot of folks that saw $100 million coming and really did not know what to do with it initially. And then their attempt to try to spend it, and Cory realizing that he had to do the tremendous amount of credit claiming and say, we've been able to do this on a political time frame, that there was a rush to do certain things that may have needed a lot more time to be thought out. I think a lot of the reform-minded philanthropists did not truly understand that the average voter is not the average parent. So what do I mean by that? The average parent with a child in a charter school is not the average voter in a Democratic primary, which is what you'd have in Newark. You have that here in New York, in Harlem in particular, Brooklyn. And so they're trying to get individuals, they're putting a lot of money into the coffers of folks running for office so that they would in turn spend it on what we would use as what we would term as sort of these traditional campaign operations, mail, canvassing, all of that stuff. But it takes a lot more time and a lot more money when you're trying to convince individuals that don't have necessarily a regular voting record, as opposed to people who vote in Democratic primaries, who are generally older and a lot more and who are organized by the political bosses in the neighborhood or the unions where they get their political cues from elsewhere. So it's a very different, so I think they had to learn that. And I think over time, especially here in New York, they've sort of changed tactics. One or two other points that I'd raise is that those political bosses really do matter. So everyone's organizing. So you were talking about how big the forums got within a blink of an eye, and that's a result of not just a reaction to what the reformers are doing, but that's also a result of unions organizing, political bosses unionizing. So everybody on both sides is doing an incredible amount of work, and oftentimes the conversation doesn't really take place. It's you see this in the public sphere in terms of this anger going back and forth, but you don't really see it behind the scenes in terms of some real dialogue going back and forth about what should and should not happen. And the last point that I would make in terms of the philanthropists themselves, it's not new that there's been a lot of tension between philanthropists and others coming into the community, community members feeling that there's this fearing this xenophobia or concerned about who's coming into the community. Go back to Ocean Hill-Brownsville in 1968, Ford Foundation, what they were doing in Ocean Hill-Brownsville, and how a lot of Black Power activists, but activists broadly, really pushed back and wanted a greater say in what was happening in their neighborhood. And so it's not a new story. It's actually a very old story that, unfortunately, in going into the politics of it, there's still a challenge that folks have in terms of understanding how to be in communities of color, how to work with them. You don't need a surrogate, you need an operative, and I think that was one of Cammie's major flaws, that she deputized a lot of people to go out and speak for her as opposed to getting people to say, how do we do this and bringing the community in? It's a very different strategy, but I think it may have netted different results than what we've seen.
So Nick, Basil's point about the role of philanthropy, I think, provides a good transition. I know you've thought about these issues quite a bit, as well as kind of mapping out and thinking about some of the consequences of the inequality in the American system and the attitudes and influence of the very wealthy. I wonder, does the book, in your mind, open a window to some of those broader issues about what is the proper role of philanthropy? What's the nature of concern that we should have about unequal influence to those who have substantial resources to bring to bear? And is this something we need to be thinking about in terms of just the viability of public institutions and democratic accountability? Those are big questions, but I'll let you take the part you want.
Well, let's see. First of all, the fact that for whatever economic reason or political reason, inequality has increased so much since about 1980, that's driving philanthropy, because we're in a period, as we were in the late 19th century, where very large fortunes are being accumulated by a fairly small number of people, and those people then kind of move out of the business space into the public life space and try to do things, and I'm prepared to say with the absolute best will in the world. It should be noted, though, a couple of things. I don't know if you saw this, Dale, of my wife is having a little Facebook spat with our former boss, Don Graham. I don't know if you've seen that, but she posted something skeptical about the Chan Zuckerberg Foundation. And he said, what do you want them to do? Buy yachts with their money? But that's, first of all, I accept the book's portrait of Zuckerberg as an entirely admirable and well-intentioned person. I think the yacht question is a bit of a red herring because he has so much money that you can't, there aren't enough yachts in the world to take up all of his money. And it's just true, without blaming anybody. Well, two things I'll say. One is, I'm sorry, but philanthropy of this kind is fundamentally undemocratic. It just is. And it comes from people for whom life has gone very, very well. They're very, very confident. And even foundations like the Ford Foundation, I would argue, are the least accountable major institutions in American society. They don't have customers to sell to. They don't have, they're very lightly regulated by the government. They don't have performance metrics to meet. And they can, do whatever they want. And the newer huge foundations that are essentially founder-controlled are the same. So you do have the phenomenon of people saying, I have a whole lot of money, and I'm going to try to move the public policy needle in a big, big way. And, the goal is not to do things like run for office. There's a lot of trash talking of Mitt Romney, but, he's playing the game outlined in the U.S. Constitution. And whatever the goodwill, a lot of these philanthropists are trying to massively change public policy that came into being over decades and decades through a lot of bloody battles and essentially democratic, messy processes, and, move them in a profoundly different direction. So, big surprise, even if you take out the race issue, big surprise that people aren't okay with that. Especially since it has the element of, literally nobody I've ever met in the school reform movement sends their kids to public school, and most of them didn't go to public school themselves, and just don't have a lot of inner bullshit detector on things you tell them about what really goes on in public schools. So, there isn't all that much to do about this situation, and there's other than to say, at least in my opinion, the part of the message of Dale's book is democracy is good, and the more these impulses to change the school system through philanthropy that is well-intentioned but undemocratic get pushed into being part of the democratic system, that's a healthy thing. And to frame it as, established bureaucratic interest groups are setting themselves up in opposition to the public interest is not a good frame. And anyway, so I could say a lot more, but that's a good place to stop.
Let me put this in, and any one of you want to jump in on this. So some of these issues may relate to foundations generally, including ones, that have been around for a long time, pretty bureaucratized, like Ford. And then there's these newer foundations, often generated from Silicon Valley money, venture capitalist oriented. I wonder how much of this any of you think is reflecting in particular sort of the personal backgrounds and business backgrounds and life experience of these folks with the newer sources of wealth.
Yes. I'm working on a book that sort of touches on this. I won't talk about education, I don't think, but when I was a dean and I was fundraising, I developed this kind of rule that I didn't tell the people I was fundraising from, which is the way you give away your money looks like the way you made your money. And so if people made their money by building like a big company, they tend to be more institutionally oriented. And if they made their money, and maybe that'll be Mark Zuckerberg when he's 50, but if they made their money like in fields like private equity, venture capital, et cetera, they're basically making a lot of money by, in their mind, unlocking suppressed value by taking institutions and structures apart. So in their head is, very reinforced by experiences, the way to solve a problem is blow up the set of institutions that exist to deal with it and create a new set of institutions. Because that's what they do all day, and they do it well, and it's served them well. So it just moves really smoothly into these other fields.
It's also just interesting how these new philanthropists, and I'm saying, since 2000, Bill Gates, Eli Broad, Michael Dell, all of these people with these fortunes that were made basically disrupting existing industries, are now the leading education philanthropists, and they want to disrupt the status quo in education. And they want to do it the way they succeeded in business. So like Eli Broad has this whole, superintendent's academy, and he's training a new group of people who he hopes will be leaders in education by training them in business. He thinks there's not enough principles of business management in school districts, and that's a big part of what's wrong with them. And Mark Zuckerberg's idea was that you need to reward teachers the way you reward people at Facebook, because that's how you draw the most talented people with the greatest visions of success in their lives. They want to make a lot of money. And I thought that was actually very interesting, because they did end up with some merit pay in the teacher's contract, but it was relatively small. It's $5,000 if you're rated highly effective, and if you, in addition to that, are in a very low poverty school, you can get $10,000. And I asked so many teachers who got the bonuses how they felt about them and if it had affected the way they taught, knowing that the bonus was out there. And they all said, first of all, they were really pleased to have the money. And many of them, it was the first time they'd felt appreciated as really excellent teachers, because they weren't being paid any differently from teachers who weren't working very hard. But secondly, it had absolutely no effect on the way they taught, because what moved them to teach was to have an effect on children's lives. And that was their reward. That was their merit bonus. I said, well, what would make you teach better and have a better effect on your kids? And they said, a really excellent supportive principal and really supportive working conditions. And I just thought it was so interesting how different that is from what Mark Zuckerberg thought would improve teaching. It's just like they're different industries, and they're different incentives.
It also gets into a theme that runs through the whole history of Teachers College and will never be resolved, which is what is teaching for, what are schools for? So a lot of the philanthropists have no problem with this statement. The reason teachers are here on earth, and this is, again, with the best will in the world, is to confer skills upon their students that will help them become economically successful. Full stop. I'm guessing those of you who are teachers or teachers in training, that little sentence doesn't capture why you're doing what you're doing with your lives. And that's a fundamental just difference in worldview. Bill Gates, who again, I'm sure has wonderful, good heart and all that, he's always quoted saying these things they shouldn't be saying, like, I don't understand why people read books in school, because, they really should learn to code and stuff like that, because the focus is so much on, you've got to use education to acquire work-related skills and just take them out into the economy. And that's how education can serve you.
Yeah.
And I think that I forgot to say, like with Gates, it's all metrics, it's
Right.
all measurement. And, that works for him. That works for for Microsoft, that works for business in a lot of businesses. But, then when you take that and you sort of make the leap that therefore we need to measure teachers based on their student test scores, where do you get that?
And also,
I'm sorry, and that's why, and just off that point alone, that's what concerns me about a lot of these reformers. I absolutely love the comment that they'll spend their money the way they make their money. I think that's so true. There are, having worked with a lot of these individuals, they are so drawn to the metrics. But that's not something you can do in 2 years and 5 years. You have to be in it for the long haul. But I don't suspect Mark Zuckerberg's going to go to a community meeting at St. Nicholas Houses. That's just not going to happen. And so all they're going to do is say, well, here's the pot of money, which, if you're Cory Booker, you're not going to turn down. No one's going to turn down $100 million. Surprising that he actually raised the second half, but you're not going to turn down $100 million. But the question is, what strings are attached to how that money is spent, and what hoops do you have to go through to prove to the folks who got you the money that you're actually making progress, and is that progress real? There's an article here in a Business Insider I was reading earlier, and it says the alarming new study says charter schools are America's next subprime mortgages. I don't know how true that is. Clearly, tremendous hyperbole, but I would imagine, I would hope. But it is a fear that if the results aren't as quick as they would like it to be, if the metrics are not there in the way that they would like it to be, these funders would like it to be, will they just pack up and go somewhere else? And then what's the community left with?
So I want to, in some way, a major issue in the book is transparency and information, and what citizens of Newark knew and didn't know. And you're a journalist, and Nick's a journalist. I see we've got some journalists in the audience, including Sarah Carr, who wrote a great book on New Orleans education reform. And Basil, you're not a journalist, but you get to see what actually goes on in the back rooms and in the communities, and then see how it's portrayed in the media. So you could tell this story as kind of journalism as hero, in terms of this book and some of the reporting in New Jersey. But you can also raise questions about why haven't some of these dimensions of the issue been explored more in the media. I wonder whether some of you have thoughts about that.
First of all, it shouldn't be this way, but it is this way. In fact, it's insane that it isn't this way. Education is not the sort of prestige beat in journalism. There's a tremendous focus on covering the presidential campaign. You want to, if you're an ambitious journalist, you want to be in Iowa right now. You don't want to be covering school systems. And it's crazy, I think, because, if you work for a metro paper, your readers care a hell of a lot more about the schools that all their kids go to. That's life for them. That's why it turns mayoral elections in Newark, Washington, D.C., and many other places. They don't care about the Iowa caucuses nearly as much, but there's this push from editors and reporters to sort of go away from education. And then in elite journalism, not all journalism, but this sort of small world of elite journalism, I think this is changing now, but at the, waiting for Superman moment, there was enormous, swallowing hook, line, and sinker the whole sort of prepackaged narrative of education reform, charter schools, et cetera. It was very ahistorical, not research-based, not a lot of, doing what journalists are supposed to do and bring in skepticism. You're not supposed to accept a gift-wrapped story. But people did for a while. And, I had an experience where I was supposed to debate one of the people who had written Waiting for Superman. I did a little bit. And he sort of gets up and says, now, why did we make this movie? We made this movie because no one ever talks about public school. I said, really? What planet do you live on? But the planet he lives on is one where He didn't go to public school. No one he knows went to public school. And it's just this off-the-screen thing. And suddenly, he's going to, even though the title makes fun of people like this, they're going to come in and sort of call attention to the problem that no one's ever talked about before. And then every time you challenge these guys on anything, and I had some debates with both the people who made the movie, they say, "Oh, we're not experts. You're right. We're just trying to call attention to the subject." There's. I just find it very, very frustrating to deal with.
I think it also depends too on the publication. But I do think that if you intersect local politics, particularly around election time and particularly around endorsements, where you talk about union endorsements, and so on, that's when education issues may get covered more. So, for example, the AFT, Randy Weingarten, endorses Hillary Clinton fairly early in the process, and then a few weeks later, she makes a comment which seems to pull back a little bit in terms of support for charter schools. Not terribly, not significantly, but a little bit. But it was enough to spark a significant conversation, right? But if in locally here in New York, the Post writes a story. Well, let's go back to 2010 and thereabout. 2012, 2014. Every time there's a state legislative election, the Post and the Daily News are writing significantly stories about what our legislators are doing, what are they doing around education. The Post is fairly obvious as to why and kind of what position they're taking. The Daily News less so, but they're still writing. What I also found interesting back in 2010 was that there was all this anger about the state legislature. Charlie Rangel had these ethics violations, and people were saying, you got to get him out, got to get him out. I was running uptown on school choice, but it actually really didn't come up on the ground, which was interesting. But a lot of the folks who were supporting one side or another made the race about that. And the New York Times never wrote about it, not that entire year. And they've done very few stories on school choice around that time. And only now they're starting to pick up a little bit more in terms of their reporting on it, but they didn't really talk about it. And I thought it was interesting that this was sort of my race, and interestingly enough, turned out to be a very contentious race, and got a lot of national coverage, and they didn't write about it at all. So I found that fascinating.
The Times, Dale's husband is an editor at the Times, so I'm sure there's a good explanation for this. They did shut down their education desk and do not have a per se education desk. That's, I don't want to make too much of that, but
so I'm going to, because I did promise we'd leave time for the audience, I want to enforce a time limit on this one, and as our last question. So we are in a presidential campaign period now, so I'm going to ask you, if one of the candidates gave you a call this evening, they heard about this panel and wanted to know what they should do. And since they're very busy people, they'd only give you a minute or so to respond. How would you distill the lessons from this that are transferable into the kinds of things you'd like to see the candidates addressing?
Well, I would like them to understand that the debate isn't about charter schools versus district schools, because there are good and bad charter schools and good and bad district schools. It's about good schools, and it's about getting enough resources to the schools at the ground level where the kids are, so that those schools can be successful.
And per our discussion being consultative. And the other thing I would add is, as everybody knows, when President Obama came into office, it was a big question mark. What do you do on education? He didn't talk a lot about it in the campaign, and there was a kind of argument over who would be education secretary. One of the candidates was Linda Darling-Hammond, late of Teachers College a few years ago. And, so he could have gone either way. Presidents get almost all of what they get done in the first year, so you sort of have to move fast. But it's tough to have to make that kind of a decision that quickly. And he's already, retreated somewhat from some of the testing orientation. For example, the one other thing I'd say quickly is, the there's a whole lot of things that happen in education. It's very frustrating to watch, the succession of magic bullets, if that's not a mixed metaphor. It's all about class size. No, it's all about resources. No, it's all about racially integrating classrooms. No, it's all about community engagement. No, it's all about what the curriculum is. No, it's all about these governance and management structures. So I'd say the next president, if they can, look at people like Jeff. Once I was invited as a naive journalist to give a talk at the American Education Research Association. I said, oh, that'll be a nice little group. And it's like Madison Square Garden. I said to the person who invited me, how many members does the AERA have? 25,000. Triple the number of journalists. There's all these people, many of whom are in this room, who've spent their lives studying all these problems, all these variables, and what kinds of things affect outcomes in a positive and negative way. And it's just not that hard. The literature is there, it's waiting for you to try to take a richer advantage of it, even if you have to move quickly, instead of saying, I'm going to pick one variable and not pay any attention to any of the others.
Just piggyback off of Dale's point, just that all schools matter, and it should not be an either or. All could coexist. And parents and teachers know. Go to the communities. They know and will be happy to tell you how to teach their kids. And just focus on that.
Thank you. So we do have time for some questions from the audience. We have a mic here. I'm going to ask that you keep your question short and as a question.
Hi, Susan Crawford, longtime attendee of forums here at Teachers College and literacy advocate, and I greatly appreciate it. I've heard you speak a few times on TV. Really appreciate you taking on that challenge and following the money. And I would hope all four of you would write a book together, given your various areas of expertise, from the issue of research and the kind of merit pay research that Bill Gates tries to push on people when there's literally research that refutes it from Carnegie Mellon and MIT. And I appreciate many of the things Nicholas Lehman said about philanthropy. And I would hope people on this panel would follow that money as well, because it's really steering the agenda, and it's a lot more about de-democratizing the whole charter school and reform movement. And so I would just ask Jeff, if this is something that comes up in a way that could be brought out more, because everything was so important that was said here, but it's not making it into the public discourse. And one reason is the Gates Foundation funds the Education Writers Forum each year in various parts of the country.
No fair asking me questions. No, I mean, look, I think these issues, and I think Dale's book, is emblematic of that. These issues are being talked about. They're probably being talked about a little bit more now in this period where everyone's digesting the backlash against high-stakes testing and some of the retreats on some of those issues in terms of national policy. So there's a little more open space, I think, for these kinds of questions and issues and discussions. Other questions?
I have a question for Dale. So I think this was one of Mark Zuckerberg's earliest big gifts to education. And I'm wondering if you, in any of your conversations with Cory Booker, were able to find out from him why he approached Mark Zuckerberg for this gift, when there's a lot of other funders who are working in the same space, giving to New York, other schools in this area as well. So why did he go after Zuckerberg, not Mark Zuckerberg?
Well, he basically found out from somebody who was a big supporter of his, who was also very close to Mark Zuckerberg. Actually, Sheryl Sandberg's brother-in-law told him that Mark Zuckerberg wanted to do something big in education, and he was looking to make his first big gift. So he found out that they were both going to be at a conference together, and
arranged to sit next to him at a buffet dinner and got talking to him, and they took a walk together. So that's how it happened.
Dale will be giving out Mark Zuckerberg's email address. Other questions?
Yeah, I actually have a pretty loud voice, so okay. Just a quick question about incentives. I know you talked about the teachers being happy that they received merit pay. Did the conversation ever turn into, well, instead of merit pay, we just pay them a living salary? Like if you talk about comparing, full disclosure, I was a teacher prior to, but if you're trying, one of your biggest points, right, is that you want to maintain quality, but you don't want it to become a business-centered institution, because that's not what it is. But at the same time, you don't have the high-quality teachers staying. So there might be other teachers that are really, really good that don't enter the school system. And in that way, businesses might have the advantage. And I wonder if anybody ever commented on that, if you ever heard any of that discussion. To like find a happy medium between some aspects of the business world that does work, and how you can merge those with the schools that you spoke with.
Well, I didn't hear anybody on the reform side talking about raising this. I think Mark Zuckerberg would like to raise the salary of teachers generally. I mean, I think that's what he feels. But, he has a lot of money, and he looks to spend it and thinks everybody has a lot of money and can spend it. But, I mean, he did want to much more significantly raise the starting salaries of teachers in the early years, because, it takes 15 years or so to start getting major raises. But, because the system is so backloaded, and there were so many senior teachers in Newark, they couldn't raise the starting salary and keep those salary bumps, as they call them, for the senior teachers. And the senior teachers won out. So
The places in the world, including in the U.S., that pay teachers more generously are the places that have a more sort of liberal or social democratic governance structure. But that's exactly the structure that the new philanthropists believe doesn't work and has failed. So there's a little bit of a contradiction there. But when I've talked I often will have these conversations with school reform enthusiasts, and there's no one more enthusiastic than a school reform enthusiast. Says every teacher in America should make $200,000 a year. But, for that to happen, you have to have a much bigger public sector, which is much better resourced, and taxes have to be much higher. So you can't just snap your fingers and make it so. It's built into a larger social consensus. A big, it's kind of a talking point of the anti-school reform people, but, one of their favorite talking points is to say, okay, let's look at Finland, which you're always holding up. Teachers are paid way more relative to everybody else in society. They have tenure, they don't have merit pay, how come it works?
So, one more question. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Liz Willen. I'm the editor of the Hechinger Report. We're here at TC, and one of the rare breeds that really does believe that what's happening in schools is more important than what's happening in Iowa right now, and that's what reporters should be covering. Dale, my question is for you. I feel like you kicked the reform movement in the balls in your book, and I'm very curious about what kind of response you've had from the Cory Bookers and from Cami Anderson and from the folks in Newark, because you really challenged that narrative that Nick was talking about in ways that I haven't seen other journalists do.
Not as much as Diane Ravitch.
right.
How have they been responding? What's been the feedback for your findings and for your reporting?
Well, and initially there wasn't a lot of pushback, but there have been lately, mainly organized by Chris Cerf, who's the superintendent in Newark. He replaced Cami Anderson. A lot of, argument that things are actually going really well in Newark, and that I, created a narrative of failure where there's actually great success. And now I've noticed that people like Joel Klein tweet those things whenever Chris Cerf says them. And I didn't say that everything had failed. There were some successes in Newark that, individual events and individual schools that did well, but the overall district schools didn't. And in fact, the kids are doing worse, and there's a financial crisis in the school district, and that's where a majority of the kids are. But Cammie Anderson has, she says each time she speaks, she says she respects me, but that she feels I didn't, acknowledge all the successes that she had. And that she says that she was much more, collaborative with the community than I give her credit for. And I think that Cammie, I think she was probably the most community-oriented person among the reformers. And I think she cared very deeply about the community, but in the end, the time frame was that we're going to do this quickly, and she had this grand reform plan called One Newark, and parents were not consulted on how the entire school district would be reorganized. And so that led to tremendous pushback for her. But I haven't really, other than what I said about, what Chris Surf says, and now noticing that Joel Klein tweets everything Chris Surf says, I haven't really noticed a big pushback other than that. But it may be coming.